Greetings, everyone. My name is Nicholas, a member of the Adjudication Corps for this year's Australs, and I will be presenting our justification for the test debate that took place during the judge test for this year's Australs. The contents for this justification or for this briefing will be very simple. Firstly, I'll announce the decision and the range. Secondly, some disclaimers or frequently asked questions. Thirdly, our justification itself. Then lastly, some general reminders for everybody. So let's immediately proceed with the decision and range. It was a unanimous decision in favor of the negative bench, and what is presented here is the range that we used for scoring each speaker throughout the debate. Let's proceed then immediately to some of the disclaimers. Firstly, just to clarify, judges and all submissions are graded using a blind scoring system, where each submission is scored anonymously by multiple members of the adjudication core team. These two things are done to make sure that each participant has a very good chance of being scored as objectively as possible. Second disclaimer, you'll not be punished for voting for the affirmative bench. So if we return to the range that was presented here, which by the way reflects what was an above average to very excellent debate, you will see that despite it being a unanimous decision in favor of the negative bench, it was also unanimous among all members of the adjudication core that the debate was quite close. That is to say, if you even take the worst case scenario, the negative bench only outperforms the affirmative bench by a 0.5 margin. The implication of this, of course, being that in this test, the adjudication core have agreed that an individual who submits a ballot in favor of the affirmative bench should not be punished for doing just that. Instead, they should still be assessed as objectively as possible, where things like your logic, things like your ability to analyze the issues will still be things that are taken into account. And we will not use the decision itself as a factor for your score. And lastly, you will not be punished for using different issues or standards, as opposed to the justification that I'm about to present. This is simply because even if you do agree with the adjudication core team that negative bench won, yet you have a different read on the issues, different read on the standards, this is perfectly fine. Again, having similar issues as us could be a plus, but having different issues that you're able to clearly communicate and analyze very well is also a plus in and of itself. So don't have a cause for concern if you see that you have different issues than us, because again, we will assess everything as objectively as we possibly can. To also be transparent about it to some extent, the basis or the factors that we used to score each justification include, but are not limited to, how well judges were able to structure their analysis, how close these scores provided by the judges were to the range that we created, how reasonable each judge was when navigating the exchanges in the debate, and of course, how clearly the judges were able to communicate their logic when coming to their decision. Let's now proceed with our justification itself. We ultimately had two standards for analyzing who won that can be divided into these two questions. The first question is, where is structural change for rights, both collective and individual, more likely to succeed? Let's quickly summarize the affirmative bench's contributions here before we talk about the reasons why we still think negative bench came to win this exchange, or came to win this issue. The affirmative bench argues two things to prove that structural change is more likely to succeed. Firstly, that you get more media attention and collective action due to your being a centralized bloc. The example they present is the BLM movement. Secondly, they say that placing an emphasis on collective rights is a prerequisite for a sustainable fight for individual rights as the emphasis. They have two sub-levels here. Firstly, this creates better protection for vulnerable groups to protest. Secondly, it makes underprivileged individuals feel secure enough to protest and arrive at a critical mass. Affirmative bench suggests that this is important because it mitigates splintering, it reduces the criticism that the most conservative parties will use against social movements, where they suggest they are largely disorganized and cannot determine themselves what they want. And lastly, that the aforementioned allows social movements to better convince the masses to accept the change these movements desire. The negative bench is still able to win this exchange for three different reasons. These are what you can see currently on your screen. Firstly, the negative bench prove that the collective rights that affirmative bench want to achieve are far harder to achieve. The negative bench is able to demonstrate this uniquely by proving these following three things. Firstly, that it will be easier to antagonize social movements in the affirmative bench, who are likely already feared, when they are enshrined as a union. Secondly, that right-leaning parties will more easily co-opt collective rights as threatening due to bolstered fear in affirmative bench. But lastly, that this attack from right-leaning parties will likely be more intense in the affirmative bench. The reason for this being that the response to the threat is not only shooting down the protests, but also quelling the threat entirely in their interest of security. The second thing the negative bench does here to win this issue is prove that individual rights are less likely to be perceived of these same criticisms or these same threats. They use two things to prove this. Firstly, that they can be framed as extensions of universal personal liberty, so they won't be subject to the same level of scrutiny. Or secondly, that they are often tied to unique personal experiences, making them far more relatable. The third and last reason why negative bench is still able to win this issue was them being able to prove that platforms for collectivizing will exist regardless, as even right-leaning individuals often demand for the platforms that the affirmative bench want to make their own voices heard. In other words, they prove that there is no trade-off between advocacy for collective rights and individual rights, because because all social movements here, even those emphasizing individual rights, use collective rights as ways to achieve those individual rights. At this point, the negative bench not only casts a significant shadow of doubt on whether or not the added influence from collective action overcomes the significant increase in opposition they encounter uniquely, but they also prove that the benefits of the affirmative bench are largely inexclusive. For those three reasons that were mentioned earlier, we came to the conclusion that the negative bench won the first exchange with regards to whether or not structural change for rights are more likely to cede an affirmative bench. The second question we used for analyzing who won the debate was, where are rights more equitable towards viable shareholders in the debate? There were two reasons that we used to say that negative bench won, but again, let's quickly summarize the affirmative case. The affirmative bench argues two things to prove that emphasis for individual rights will lead to equitable change. Firstly, that the emphasis on individual rights requires an arbitration of lived experiences and comes at the expense of other rights. And secondly, that due to perverse incentives, the rights alienated by the process are the most vulnerable individuals of the community. The affirmative bench then suggests that the emphasizing of individual rights is principally abhorrent, as it gives preferential treatment to privileged members of the community. They say that the platform for intersectionality only exists when the need for consensus and negotiation for the bargaining process to occur is something that is prevalent and something that is proliferating. Negative bench is still able to win this issue for two reasons. Firstly, they're able to prove that the co-option that the affirmative bench wanted to avoid is not mutually exclusive to the negative bench. There were two things used by the negative team to prove that this was true. Firstly, that the majority of the people who comprise social movements can still displace minorities within these movements in the affirmative bench, thus debunking the point that co-option occurs due to the majority movement. But secondly, that the vastness of these groups will only motivate more splintering. The second and last reason the negative bench is able to use to win this issue is proving that individual rights are more aligned with the interests of vulnerable shareholders. They prove this by demonstrating the following: that individual liberties are what are more valuable to the most vulnerable shareholders of this debate. But secondly, that the affirmative bench's own case is at odds with itself. That is to say, when affirmative bench simultaneously argue that it is dehumanizing to fight for individual rights, but also suggest that collective rights are a prerequisite for achieving these, it is then both unclear and also potentially concessionary for affirmative bench to adopt their own strategy, insofar as it doesn't clearly say it, but it strongly implies that the frame of individual rights is something that is the foremost thing in the debate. At this point, because the negative bench prove that the harms pointed out by the affirmative bench are not mutually exclusive, but also simultaneously sustain their own competitive advantage throughout the debate, the negative bench is able to win the second issue. And because the negative bench are able to prove that, firstly, again, structural change for rights is more likely to succeed on their bench, but also that the rights that they arrive at, assuming success is symmetric on both sides, are more equitable on the negative bench. The negative bench was able to win this debate on a very close margin. Before we conclude, some general reminders from me. Firstly, please use the Australs scale for scoring. For the main speeches that are non-reply speeches, use 70 to 80. And for reply speeches, use 35 to 40. We encountered multiple submissions where the reply scores were not in this range. Moreover, we also received multiple submissions where the main speeches were scored with decimals. Please take note that only reply scores will be using decimals throughout this tournament. So those are the first two general reminders. The third general reminder is also about reply scores. Again, be extra cautious when scoring replies. We've encountered the trend where, for example, a submission thinks the debate is average, so they give scores of this to the speakers of 75 and 76. But then the reply score they give is 35. Remember, a 35 reply score is equivalent to a 70. That is to say, you're not subtracting 40 from the score you're giving to arrive at the reply score that is equivalent. You are dividing by 2. So if you think the reply speech is equivalent to a 75, you divide that by 2, you get 37.5. You don't subtract 40 and get 35. The last general reminder is please refrain from not judging the debate as it happened, or to say it one more time in case that's not clear. Judge the debate as it happens. Do not invent issues. Do not invent standards. Use what the debaters use to assess their own material, to assess their opponent's material, criticize their metrics instead of coming up with your own metrics. We noticed that there were a lot of material that were often missed out by some of the teams during the justifications of different submissions, that instead of using material that was created and argued quite well by the speakers, judges will invent their own material and plug in a lot of their own holes with their own analysis to assess who won the debate. This is a big no-no. Please use the material that actually occurs during the debate when arriving at your decision. And that concludes our briefing for this evening, or for this morning or afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you all so much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to approach any member of the adjudication core. Thank you so much.